So, really, but it is a great pleasure here. So, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure, really, for me to introduce Cristiano Nicosia here for this talk, because I've been, working with him. I get to introduce him, if we start that way, for many reasons. In part because of my role as the director of the Tchaikovsky Institute here, but in this case, it's really because of the work that we've been doing for many years together in Slovenia. And in fact, we were saying, we normally speak to each other in these occasions wearing shorts and being kicked in dirt and in other situations. So this is actually a new one for us as well. But it's actually one that is very important because fieldwork plays a really important part in Cristiano's career, about which I will tell you. He graduated in 2004 from the University of Padova in archaeology. As part of that, he spent a year at the University of Boston studying archaeology and micromorphology. Then he did an MA in soil science at the University of Ghent in Belgium, which he finished in 2006, and then moved on to the University of Milano, where he studied geoarchaeology for his PhD, which he finished in 2012, and as part of which he also spent a semester in Cambridge. He's currently employed, self-employed, as a consultant. His main activity is a professional consultant in geoarchaeology and micromorphology from his hometown Vicenza in northeast Italy, but also employed as a research fellow at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, as you can see here. And he, on an occasional basis, or on a regular but adjunct basis, teaches geoarchaeology at the University of Padova, so all in the northeast of Italy. But still, as I said, fieldwork, and that's how we know each other, fieldwork is his main activity, and he's involved in a series, structurally involved in a series of field projects in the Po Plain, North Italy, in the Gavi project outside Rome, and in Sardinia, of course, previously in the Taralba project, and currently in Suraki, but also in Tanzania, where he's involved in work in the Olduvai Gorge. And finally, he's co-editor of a new handbook on archaeological soil and sediment micromorphology that will be out later this year, published by Blackwell, one of these massive 500-page volumes. Good, so with all of that, you'll see Cristiano is someone, archaeologist, micromorphologist, combining, really spanning these two disciplines, and with most of all, has had a lot of field experience, and that's precisely what he's going to talk to us about. So Cristiano, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for organizing the talk and for inviting me, and thanks for coming. So, geoarchaeology, okay, sediments in context. I'm going to try to show you what geoarchaeology is all about through a series of examples that work like this. They start from examples at the regional scale, something more at the near site scale, then going down to site, and then going into the micro scale or feature or context scale. So what I want, it's like a funnel going down, always zooming in. And the first example I want to show you comes from the area of the margin of the Apennines. So here in central part of North Italy, in the Po Plain, and this is a picture. If you go on the Apennines, you look north towards the plain. Okay, you see it's very flat, and the link, basically, what links the mountain range to the floodplain is a series of terraces or alluvial fans. Okay, and if we look here, this is a small geomorphological map. The Apennines are down here. We were standing somewhere here, looking north, and these are a series of alluvial fans. The yellowish, orange ones are very old. They are Middle Pleistocene. They are chunks of old fluvial plains that have been uplifted, and they are just relict. They just stay there. Nothing goes on as far as sedimentation is concerned. Then the purple one are alluvial fans after the last glaciation, so they are late Pleistocene, of the final part of the last glaciation. Then the arrows show more recent alluvial fans. Okay, they are Holocene, early Holocene. And then all this part with lines, vertical lines, and the brown-gray things that look like worms. Those are basically alluvial ridges crossing the floodplain. So this is the setting, okay? And the time period I'm focusing for this example is basically the transition between the Neolithic and the Copper Age, which is also called Chalcolithic, and the rest of of the presentation, I will use the word chalcolithic, okay? This passage is very important. It also, if we look in this column at the level of chromosomes, it corresponds to the passage between the subboreal period, the Atlantic period, sorry, the Neolithic, and the subboreal period. So it's a transition in cultural phases, let's say, which also, for some reason, and we will see, corresponds to a transition in environmental conditions. Now, this transition is generally referred to as a abrupt change toward colder and wetter conditions. Okay, with the onset of the subboreal means colder and wetter environmental conditions. There's alpine glacier advance, and there's also higher lake levels. Now, if we take the alpine iceman, who was found at the border between Italy and Austria, he was a man of the end of the Neolithic, of the early Copper Age. He was a witness of the moment of this environmental change. And what happened to him is incredible, because he was walking, when he was alive, he was walking on, let's say, non-glaciated ground. He was walking in an area that was not permanently occupied by a glacier. And the year he died, he got covered by snow, and that snow didn't melt the next year. It became fern, and then from fern became ice, and then from being a side branch of a glacier became incorporated in a larger glacier. And he was never released by the ice until they found him in the early 90s, I think, which means basically that he witnessed, he was dead, so he didn't really witness, but okay, he was there when there was this improvised advance in the glacier. If we plot the age of the iceman into the curves of methane and delta oxygen 18, we see that from this point on the two curves diverge, okay, whereas they were converging earlier. And it means, okay, there is a change, something changes. And what it tells at a global scale, so these are ice cores in Greenland, etc., it tells that the conditions are becoming wetter and becoming at the latitude of this study area and cooler. Okay, so abrupt change towards cooler and wetter conditions. Now, if we go back, let's say, on Earth, and we look at the soils, which is what I do basically, if we look at Neolithic soils in these sequences, it's a well-developed soil. It's decarbonated, it's thick. Okay, it means that this soil has been exposed for a long period of time, so that weathering could transform it and exactly weather it. And so to have a long period of stability with soil formation means that the environment is stable somehow. Nothing is happening. There's no sedimentation, no erosion. There's pedogenesis, we say, soil formation. If we go towards the apex of these alluvial fans, the sequences sort of pinch out. The soils become welded, we say. And if we see, we still find a Neolithic soil, a soil that has been dated to the Neolithic. The gravel of the alluvial fan is still visible, and we see the color is very red, very oxidized. This is a well-developed soil. The soils of the Neolithic in this area, either at the margin of the fans or at the apex of the fan, are well-developed soils, which indicate long stability. If we go into the chalcolithic soil, so the subboreal soil, okay, we see many superimposed phases of pedogenesis separated by alluvial sediments. And this tells us that there is sedimentation, flooding basically, short phase of stability with formation of a weakly developed soil, and then again sedimentation, and then a short phase of stability with development of a weakly developed soil. Sedimentation, stability. So the environment has changed, the situation has changed. There's aggradation, there is sedimentation. The rivers bring in sediments. These sedimentation episodes are separated by short periods of stability. Another indicator of instability with the subboreal is this plot that I made reworking data that were made for basically geological hazards. And these people dated landslides by dating tree trunks buried by landslides or material that could be dated buried by landslides in the study area, which is here in the middle of Italy. Okay, and it turns out that from in the subboreal you begin to have a marked slope instability. So the soil tells us about instability in the subboreal. the slopes are unstable. Climate seems to be more rainy, colder. And I will show you now, to put some archaeology in this discussion, 3 sites that are located on different geomorphic units, different portions of these alluvial fans. And once you dig in those sites, you find large patches of burnt soil, okay, charcoal, but irregular patches. And so what we did was looking with the microscope to samples coming from these features. Okay, these are images taken under the microscope. And what we see are traces of slaking, which means when you have a loosened soil, disturbed soil, broken up, the rain is able to slake it, to bring down sediments at depth, okay, and create these sort of films of fine clay around the aggregates. We find traces of material from the underlying horizon being ripped up and reworked. We find charcoal, wood ash actually, retaining the morphology of the original wood anatomy, let's say, and lots of burnt soil. So the indicators point to this type of feature. These are actually tree thrones with subsequent firing of the tree stump, or better, of the root plate. And then the sediments which were attached to the root plate got burnt, of course, and went to fill these structures. And these are all Chalcolithic structures. In the Neolithic, we don't have these type of features. They all appear with the Chalcolithic period in this area, suggesting deforestation. This is deforestation touched with the hand. It is not inferred from pollen diagrams or other indicator. It is really seeing it, okay, touching. Other soils in other areas, they have a more complicated story. For example, in older terraces, there were these soils that are in a French classification termed sol lessivé à pseudoclay, which is basically a forest soil with a minor drinking problem, okay, but drinking of water in this case. So it means it's a forest soil that sometimes goes underwater, okay, it has a little bit of too much water. In the Chalcolithic, this soil withstand deforestation again. And if we look at the effects on the soil of this deforestation, basically to have severe hydromorphy, meaning lots and lots of water that doesn't drain through the roots or thanks to biogalleries, it stays in the soil and cause a phenomenon known as bleaching, which means removing iron and organic matter. And we know this fact, this hydromorphy followed deforestation because we find iron nodules, which are an indicator of hydromorphic condition, meaning water in the soil, trapping charcoal fragments. So first came the charcoal, and then came the iron, came the water, basically. These soils also suffered erosion. These laminated sediments, always so as seen in the microscope, indicate surface erosion, okay, runoff, and also the presence of aggregates coming from the soils underneath, from the deeper horizon of this same soil, being with a very rounded morphology, so they have been transported over a long distance. So to sum up basically this initial example, in the Neolithic, which corresponds to the Atlantic chronozone, we have basically landscape stability, soil formation, well-developed soils. And if we look at the archaeology, the Neolithic is characterized in North Italy by what they call flat extended sites, which are scatters of Neolithic material over enormous surfaces. And these are not interpreted as enormous sites, but rather like the same site moving and cultivating a parcel of forest and then moving to the next one. So an example of shifting cultivation. At the end result, this image is horrible, by the way, but it should be a flat extended site, okay? But by moving and shifting, it creates basically a spread of artifacts over an enormous surface. And also from the pollen and from the soil, we see a little bit of impact, anthropic impact, but not the forest cover pretty much remains untouched in this period. With the Chalcolithic, we have also the onset of the subboreal, and there is a scenario which is independent on anthropic activities of climate worsening, okay? More erosive conditions. Plus, what we record geoarchaeologically is that there is basically, we record from the archaeology that there is a social economic change, the introduction of the plow, metallurgy, and especially the introduction of transhumant pastoralism in higher areas in the Apennines, which means that there was the need to open up spaces for pasture land, meadows, which could be done by deforestation with the help of fire. And the end result of anthropic impact and let's say global condition is marked landscape instability and a landscape marked by aggradation, so sedimentation, erosion, and this kind of processes. So this was the first example. Now the second example I want to show you, we go in the near site, and it's in a site that of Paulistincus in Sardinia, was dug under the direction of Peter, and it's in a complete different area. Okay, we're still in Italy, but we are in Sardinia, along a little bit inland, let's say, from the coast of the Mediterranean, in an area that is basically covered by sand dunes mostly. And the geoarchaeology was done, okay, in the site, but I'm going to show you things that we did really literally in the near site, just beside the very sites. The site is a farmstead of the 5th to 2nd century before Christ. Now, if we go in that area, we can see there are flat zones and then higher ridges. Now, the flat zone is a deflation area. It means it's where the wind picked up the sediments and removed them, and exposed basically an old floodplain, which is very clay-rich because of the weathering of the local volcanic mountains, let's say, volcanic reliefs, okay? And then there are higher areas. These areas are dunes. They are made of sand, okay? So if I dig a hole in there where the arrow is and where the site is, I find this situation. I find clays underneath, which are outcropping here because the wind took away the sediments that were covering them, and I find sand, okay, dune sand, Aeolian sand, and all these material have been subject to soil formation for many years, many thousands of years. And what happened is that they developed what are marked here as BT horizon. You see these BT with numbers and other letters, but BT means this is a soil horizon that got enriched in clay, and this clay is not brought by a river or somehow, but is clay that is generated internally by the soil formation processes, okay? And if we look in the microscope, if we look in the microscope, BT horizon looks like this. These, let's say, golden color are actually films, coatings we call them, of clay inside the pores of that soil. And it's clay which has been produced by a soil forming process. Now we're going to forget about the reference profile for a second, and we're going to move a little bit further next to what was interpreted as being a wall. There was some sand, and this sand sort of accumulated, this whitish sand accumulated against this wall that is basically outside of the picture, sealing a dark brown horizon, which turned out to be a buried plough soil. So a plough soil of Punic period, preserved by this Aeolian sand. And I'm pretty confident this is a buried plough soil, also because if you dig this out and look at what's below it, you can still see the crisscross, they're called marks of the earth. They are impressed in the subsoil or in the horizon below. And if we look in the microscope at this soil, now we are looking at a very, very high magnification, okay? We are looking at 1, 2, 3 sand grains and a little bit of a space between the sand grains, and this space is filled with clay. And this clay is not deriving from pedogenesis, it's very dusty, it's not golden, okay? It's not laminated, it's very dirty. They call these dusty clays because they are the results of tillage. tillage loosens the topsoils and facilitates erosion in the top part of the soil and the percolation in the deeper down of dusty clay, which is the clay with organic matter, charcoal, and also phytoliths, so the basically silica skeleton of grass. And the idea we got is basically, okay, there's tillage, we saw the marks, the clay coatings are, these dusty clay coatings are consistent with this, but there must be also probably the periodic or seasonal burning of the whatever is left in the field at the end of the season, which is a technique that is very, very, very widespread in the Mediterranean. So tillage and burning. Moreover, what was very interesting is the degree of knowledge that the Punic farmers had of these soils, of the local soils, because they didn't set up this plow field starting from the topsoil. No, because the topsoil formed on a dune, it's very sandy, it's very nutrient poor. Basically what they did was cutting away the top part of the soil, reaching for that BT horizon, the one enriched pedogenically in clay, okay, in secondary clays. Why? Because these clay retain more water, and these clays are able to exchange cations, or better, they are able to exchange nutrients with plants, with the roots of plants. And so they set up their plowing, the plow field at that level, which really indicates a good knowledge of the local substrate and the local soils. Now I will move to a site or a series of sites, and I will talk about a very European, let's say, topic, okay, that is dark earth. Dark earth is a British expression, and it indicates this dark, of course, earth, this dark and seemingly homogeneous, mysterious deposit that occur in many European cities, okay, in England, in Italy, in Belgium, and they seal basically the remains of the Roman architecture. For example, this is an example from Italy. There's a dark earth deposit on top of a robbed, okay, mosaic floor. These are images from London on top of Roman structure. So the problem here archaeologically was to understand what caused this change in the style of sedimentation. What do these deposits represent in terms of evolution of the city? And many interpretations were proposed. Somebody said this must be flood deposit, brought in by a river, abandonment levels, okay? Or somebody also said the collapse of the sewer system. In Roman time, the sewer system in cities was very efficient, and maybe by collapsing created meters of dark sediments. Or also another hypothesis, urban gardens, meaning horticulture inside the city, agriculture inside the city. So I will show very briefly, of course, examples from 4 sites, 2 in Italy, 1 in Belgium, 1 in France, and we'll show you a little bit how geoarchaeology can help clarify a little bit the origin, the genesis of these dark earths. Geoarchaeology in cities is a very busy, let's say, field, because there's a lot of development work going on in cities, there's a lot of excavation for infrastructure, and of course geoarchaeologists are working with the complexity of urban stratigraphic sequences, a lot of cuts with lots of walls, etc., and the substrate is not always visible, and many other problems. So I will start with a job I did in Firenze. The Uffizi Galleries excavations took place in the 2005, between 2000 and 2005. And if we look, Florence is located here. Okay, it's in a basin that is tectonically low, and it's crossed by a river, which is the river Arno, which basically in this part had originally braided morphology, and it's a river that is loaded with a high suspended load, load of sediments, and has a rather unpredictable hydraulic regime. So moreover, if we look here, it's squeezed by the local topography and the growth of the city. So it's highly likely to flood, and in fact it did several times. The site I'm talking about is located just next to the river, okay? Here under the Uffizi, the famous Uffizi museums of Florence. There basically a sequence was dug, was found, and dark earths were found. There this layer, this dark layer in the middle. The layer is actually sealed between two alluvial episodes, well dated, and they find also, they are basically dated by radiocarbon, but there are also chronicles describing these episodes. But no obvious alluvium is found inside the dark earth, whereas these dark earths for sure are not the result of an abandonment, because they are alpha meter or 60 centimeter of anthropic sediments. So it tells us that anthropic sedimentation was very well active in this period, with dumping, with middening, throwing a lot of construction material, waste, etc. But no obvious flooding. In thin section, so looking in the microscope, nevertheless, these little crusts or this lamination, fine lamination of silts and clays inside the pores were observed. And they are called flood coatings, and they tell us basically that these were soils that were periodically flooded, but maybe there was not so much sediment brought in, not so much that we could see as a discrete alluvial layer, just a few centimeters or a few millimeters, yet the bioturbation, which means the activity of soil fauna, and the transformation and the mixing by people was so strong that we cannot see them in the macro scale. We can only see here and there these features that point to a periodic alluvial input, and this is very frequent in cities located in active alluvial settings. A little bit of sediments come in and they get reworked in the deposit, and we don't see them unless we do thin section or very detailed analysis. So, okay, here this was to say there might be an input of sediments from flooding, but it's mostly anthropic sedimentation. And another site, which is Padova, so located in North Italy, the baptistry of Padova, was instead used to demonstrate or to try the sewer hypothesis, the collapse of the sewer system hypothesis. Once again, the dark earths form on top of what you see here, which is the collapse of a Roman building with a mosaic. And in the area of the excavation area, 3 profiles were dug, and basically, okay, micromorphology was carried out, showed that mostly components are randomly oriented, they are not sorted. The analysis, chemical analysis, when had no discernible pattern with depth, they were basically zigzagging. So mostly these dark earths are dumping of material, except in very small areas where traces of trampling were observed and slow gradual build up, but this was limited to a 7th century hut. Of course, at the macro scale, in the field, everything looked very homogeneous. This differentiation was possible after a bit of analysis. But, so the explanation was not very satisfying, and I decided to go more into the dark of dark earth, in what I call the heart of darkness, okay? Because I wanted to understand, okay, where does the dark, I have a vague idea of where the earth comes from, vague, but I don't have a good idea where the dark comes from. The dark, I mean, the organic component. And so I involved other specialists, of course, of CNR and of the University of Padua, and they did 2 types of analysis. One is called molecular weight distribution. It tells us how evolved, how basically mature is the status of organic substances. And the other analysis was to look for fecal biomarkers of excrements, basically. And the analysis was gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. So basically what turned out is that if you look at this molecular weight distribution, there are 3 classes, low, intermediate, and high. And The most widespread class is intermediate. Intermediate means that basically the organic substances are not fully humified, they're not fully weathered or developed, okay? They are stuck in the middle. And this is basically, into the general picture, it tells us that the accumulation was very, very fast, and the material was probably so organic rich, plus there was a problem of reducing conditions given by bacterial and microbes, basically, that the organic matter didn't have the time to evolve completely, to degrade completely, if you want. And so it got stuck there, and that's why these sediments are so rich in organic matter and they're still so dark. About the fecal contamination, we found basically very low levels of fecal contamination, which excludes that this material come from the sewer system. But the interesting part is that the fecal material was oftentimes exclusively from herbivores, so not even from men or carnivores, which tells us that in an area that originally was occupied by a monumental Roman building, a few centuries after, there are signals of excrements, basically, of herbivores, which fits with a pattern of ruralization of the city, which is a phenomenon very well known by the historians for the late Roman and then early Middle Ages. So, okay, this clarified a bit. Now I show two examples instead of dark earth as horticultural spaces, horticultural garden. One from France, from the Marais, famous neighborhood of Paris, and they are much later. These are 16th, 17th century, because the use of the term dark earth sort of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and is used also for later medieval and Renaissance phases. But okay, they found dark earth on this area, and basically it's a palimpsest of traces, a very complicated urban sequence, but this area was interpreted as a agricultural space, and this was confirmed by analyses that were performed, namely soil micromorphology. So this is the scan of a thin section, so it's a sample put just under the scanner, and what was found was like that all across this layer, it's not visible here, this little undulating line was made of iron and manganese. And this is a crust, basically, of iron and manganese, which mimics the marks of a plow, basically. The plow compresses the soil below where it passes. This is called a plow pan. And the water cannot percolate anymore, cannot infiltrate anymore. So it creates reduction and then oxidation along the limit between the, let's say, plow pan and the soil above. Okay, so there was traces of plowing, very well. What else? By looking in the top part, we found a lot of indicators of manuring, addition of coprolites, human coprolites, okay. And if closely analyzed, these coprolites feature parasite eggs, which means that the guy was not very healthy at all. And also, or the woman, I don't know, like the person, the carrier of these coprolites was not very healthy. And also phytoliths, which are basically remains of what was being eaten. They have a high informative potential, coprolites. Ash was added to the soil, and in between ash we find also vitrified phytoliths, which is typical component of fireplaces where grasses melt in presence of alkaline ashes, alkaline salts from ashes. The phytoliths can melt. So the story here is it's a plowed and manured field, okay, in the city, because Paris was already a city in the 16th, 17th century. Brussels, another example, okay, again, dark earth, found in a context that is of the 16th, 17th century by radiocarbon date, and it was the Hotel d'Hoogstraten, it's called the site. It was a monumental palace in the city, next to the palace of Charles V, and then Charles V, his palace went burnt down, so everything was leveled, and the Grand Place of Brussels is built on top. Now, this area was made available to the visitors, and they wanted to make sure that the story was right. The story said that this palace had a garden next to it, and this garden is represented by this level of dark earth. And was it really a garden? So analysis were done, again micromorphology, meaning looked with a microscope to the soils, and what was found was again traces of manuring, which kitchen waste, burnt eggshells, fish bones, melted phytoliths, coprolites again. And the other traces that were found, there were traces of tillage, again topsoil disturbance. It rains on a disturbed and loose topsoil, so and the rain can bring down silt, clay, and organic particles and microcharcoals, giving rise to what they're called dusty clay coatings, similar to Paulistincus, similar to Paris. So basically all these contexts. So the answer here was yes, it was a garden, garden meaning a vegetable garden, or anyway horticultural area. Okay. So basically, if I go back to this slide where I have all the possible interpretation of dark earths, floods, but not really just floods, but there can be an input of fluvial sediments into the dark earth, and which is remixed in it. Abandonment levels, not so much, because abandonment doesn't produce growth of the deposit, doesn't produce anthropic sedimentation. Collapse of the sewer system, not so much, at least in the example we saw. Whereas urban gardens, urban horticultural soils, yes, this is very often the case. But the idea is that there's not a single interpretation that's possible, but it must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And geoarchaeology allows to clarify the origin of these dark earths pretty much. The last example I wanted to show you, we go in the really micro scale. We go down to, we will see an example that comes from the Lucone pile dwelling site. Okay, pile dwelling is something that looks like this. If you Google, you find on Google Images pile dwelling, this is what comes out. Okay, house built on platforms. This is the excavation, and it's located in the Morenic hills. Okay, that surround the Lake Garda in North Italy, which is a lake of glacial, not only glacial, but origin. And in the wrinkles of these moraines, there are many small basins where this is almost, you cannot see anymore the lake here, it's been drained, but peat, areas with accumulation of peat, okay, basins with very good preservation of the organic components. And in the Lucone site, there were these features here, sort of heaps, okay, which were oftentimes laminated, finely stratified. And the question by the archaeologists here was, what are these heaps? Are they some sort of structure like in situ? So they were doing something here. What are they made of? And also, were they formed on wet or on dry ground? Okay, because there's a big debate on pile dwellings. If you look at this image, whether they were built in the water, on the shore, or not, had nothing to do with the water. Basically, they were away from the water. So it's unclear. So what was done was, of course, thin sections were made. These are just thin sections put under the scanner, and we can see that there are an alternating sequence of light brown layers with darker brown layers, let's say, to simplify. And the dark brown layers are mainly organic layers. They are made of organic waste, plant material, leaves, phytoliths, seeds, fruits, okay, twigs. But we're not very much focused, and mixed with ash, and we're not focusing on them. The most interesting ones are the light brown ones that are minerogenic. They are these materials are also mixed with ash, intermixed with ash. If we look very carefully, we can see that this brown material is actually earth-based construction material. It's obtained from quarrying the local glaciogenic sediments, which is basically the sediments that make up the moraines, and also by quarrying the soils that formed on these sediments. because we find, again, what they call pedorelics, so reworked soil fragments with traces of clay elevation, soil formation, mixed into these materials. So these are basically like a sort of mud plaster, although it's not very muddy, it's rather sandy, with a high content of calcium carbonate, because moraines there are very calcium carbonate rich, which made an excellent, apparently, construction, let's say, material, earth-based material, occasionally with traces of rubefaction, so becoming red because of firing, because of burning. And what was interesting about this material is that it's mixed with large quantities of ash, and the ash gives us an idea of what the combustible that were used by these people were. We find wood ash with lots of charcoal, okay, that's pretty logic. Lots of grasses were burnt because we have these molten or vitrified phytoliths. Lots of chaff, which is basically the result of the threshing of the cereals. We find it mixed within the ash. So also chaff as a byproduct, as a waste, was burnt. And we find spherulites, which are these little dots here. And spherulites are contained in herbivore dung. And finding then blackened, which means burnt, tells us that the herbivore dung was used as a combustible. And just to give you an idea of what these spherulites are, this is an image under the SEM. When they're not burnt, they look something like this, like these little crosses here under the microscope. They're very tiny spheres of calcium carbonate that they form in the intestine of all animals, but mostly in larger quantities in capri ovides, basically. And these are intermixed with ash and burnt. So the idea is that these, we also found coprolites that I didn't really know what they were at first. And so I employed EDS, which is basically an X-ray technique, to know that these aggregates, yellowish blobs, let's say, were made of calcium phosphate or were rich in calcium and phosphorus. Therefore, they must be coprolites of carnivores and omnivores. And they were also mixed in the ash, which is probably for hygienic reasons. Okay, they ended up in these middens, in these heaps, sorry. The final idea is that these heaps derive from the cleaning of cooking installations. Cooking installation plastered with sediments quarried from the local glassygenic substrate, of course with traces of burning, exposure to heat, with large quantity of ash coming from the firing of combustibles. And probably, okay, the coprolites were just ending up as waste, okay, together with them. So the final interpretation, the question is, are they in situ activities? No, they're just dumps. They come from the repeated accumulation of waste, household waste. And the second question, did they form on dry or wet ground, which is a big question, but normally when the geoarchaeologist is on site, he gets asked all the questions of the previous excavation seasons also. The idea is that they didn't form in water, although the laminated aspect might suggest, but it's not. The point is that they lack bioturbation. They lack reworking by soil fauna, which means that the soil must have been wet, rather wet, not necessarily underwater. But of course, the soil was wet, like in a shore area where the water is basically coming to the surface, and also impregnating, let's say, embedding with water, keeping these heaps wet, because the conservation of the organic matter in them is excellent. Okay, and this is an image of what it should have looked like from ethnographic comparisons. Just a pile of trash, really, okay, outside a house. But the point is that the platforms, what people were doing on these houses is really unknown, because the platforms are never preserved. So what we can say, we learn it from the trash, really from the garbage they were throwing away, which is often the case in archaeology. And so basically, to conclude, I wanted to make 3 key points. I wanted to show that geoarchaeology works at various scales, starting from global data to geological maps at a scale of 1 to 250,000, down to submicroscopic technique or thin sections or SEM. Okay. The second point I wanted to make is context, and context is a very frequently used word in archaeology. It has different meanings. It can be the context of a site, meaning the geological context of a site. It can be context. It can be used as a synonym of assemblage, artifact assemblage. In this case, context, the context as I wanted to, as I meant it in the title of this presentation, is basically the sedimentary matrix enclosing the artifacts, or in other words, what is thrown away basically in excavation. Okay, all the dirt around the archaeological materials is thrown away, but it creates, is the context which tells us what was the depositional environment of the find, what were the post-depositional modification that occurred, and also very importantly informs if material is in its primary or secondary, okay, context of deposition, primary depositional setting. Okay, so and also sediments as the context of artifacts are used to delineate, to define stratigraphic units. We differentiate layers by color, by texture, by porosity, by basically sedimentary characteristics. Okay, this is why context is extremely important. The last thing I would like to stress is the power of soils in archaeology, because soils are not so much soil people work in archaeology, but it's not so widespread. Okay, and basically soils, they form on stable surface. Okay, they are the opposite of sedimentation, the opposite of erosion. When there is stability, a soil will form either on soft sediments or on a rock substrate. Now, any soil science book you might read about agriculture, about engineering, about vineyards in Australia, okay, they will tell you, they will talk about these factors of soil formations that are 5, and they were basically established by this guy, Hans Jenny. He was Swiss, but he was working here in the States. In 1941, he formulated this function of soil formation, okay? And they are regional climate, organism, relief, parent material, and time, okay? Any book will mention these 5. Now, if you take the average archaeologist, and you ask him, are you interested in knowing the regional climate of your site? I think he will say, well, yes, I will be really interested. Are you interested in knowing more about the organisms, meaning plants, animals, and man? Because we saw dark earth is modified, its soil processes modified by anthropic influence. Are you interested in that? Well, I think Indy would say, yes, I'm interested. Are you interested in knowing the relief, meaning the original topography of your of the area where you're working, especially useful in areas that have been heavily reclaimed, like Sardinia, for example, like the part of Sardinia where we work, okay, floodplains, etc. I think it would say yes. Parent material, well, parent material is more like the original sediments on which the soil formation took place, but parent material is sediments are context. Context is good, so you said, all right, okay, I'm interested in it. And time is, are you interested in knowing the age or the surfaces that were occurring in the landscape you're studying, the length of the exposure to the atmosphere of the surfaces where people were dwelling? Will you be interested? I think he would say yes. So soil are very powerful tool in archaeology. Moreover, this idea comes from a discussion with Peter. They also have a behavior, a scale at which they change that is very, very compatible with the scale of anthropic processes in meters, in a few hundred meters, down the slope, up slope. They change their properties, and that's very useful for the scale at which archaeology works. So I will close with one more, let's say, invitation to work at many scales, to sometimes zoom out, okay? So the need for a multiscalar approach. Sometimes it's better to zoom out for to understand what we are looking at. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristiano. Particularly, well, I think that the talk as a whole, but particularly here the ending, was a very effective plea for archaeologists to sort of think more about soils, because as you said in an earlier part of the talk, when we were talking about earlier about sediments, these were sediments in Pompeii you were talking about. Archaeologists just throw them away because that's the dirt we're looking for, the artifacts that are between them. And so I think there's actually a lot to be gained from the soil, because if you would continue with your particulars, ask archaeologists, are you interested in soil? The chances are that they might not be so interested initially. So, but before the questions, yes, please.
So you mentioned in the soil human habitation there and talked about land clearing for herbivorous animals. So assuming at some point they were slaughtered, did you ever find blood anywhere, or do you think you could find blood?
Blood?
Blood. When they were slaughtered, say in the abattoir.
No, and I don't think that blood would preserve in the archaeological record, really. So, no. I mean, I don't know if it preserves, unless very exceptional context.
No idea.
Yeah, I could be confused with the blood of some archaeologists, maybe sometimes, you know. But
that is not possible.
Going back to your first case study,
yeah,
on the edges of the Proclaim,
yeah,
next to the Apennines. So, thinking of the impact on soils and sedimentation of vegetation clearance. So if you're going from a Neolithic situation where you've got relatively small scale flat sites that are moving on a regular basis, and there's local felling of trees and other vegetation for fairly localized agriculture around that settlement. You go from that situation to one in the Chalcolithic involving probably more aggregated settlements, but also you're proposing of transhuman pastoralism at higher altitudes, which I think there's no question that that's what happened. But it's one thing to be clearing land for farming purposes around settlement sites. It's another to be trying to modify, a forested environment over a very large area in order to make pastoralism more possible, right? So if that's taking place, and if use of fire is the primary mechanism for doing that, we surely would expect a massive spike, uptick in particulate charcoal in soil cores, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, is that in fact the case? I couldn't quite tell from the...
Yeah, I think microcharcoal is what most likely you find in pollen studies that they also evaluate, and there is indeed an increase there is a lowering of the forest or the arboreal pollen and an increase in the microcharcoal floating around, let's say, in the system. Yeah, but clearly in this study, it's very hard to understand how much of the erosion we see is triggered by man and how much is just happening due to climate. I admit it's a limit to, or it's a limit of this study to be able to. It would seem that it's a co-factor, this clearing of spaces in the catchment basin of the sediments, and these sediments somehow will, at some point, will end up in the floodplain. So I think that's what we can say. But indeed, there is an increase in microcharcoals, also in the soil. The soils of the site, they always show burnt soil and tree thrones and uprooting, these kind of features, so which are not very frequent before, at least.
Just following up on that, I'm interested because I'm currently working in the Caribbean and have been loosely associated with a big human ecology project on a whole bunch of eastern Caribbean islands. And so it's a massive program of coring. And one of the very interesting things is that in all of the sequences, there's a point at which particulate charcoal really comes into focus and becomes prominent in the core. And it's assumed that that is because these islands have been colonized by humans for the first time. And in many cases, the radiocarbon date associated with those moments of uptick of particulate carbon is quite a bit earlier than what the archaeological record is telling us. So there's a big argument about whether this is truly anthropogenic charcoal in the record, or whether it's, in some cases at any rate, the result of natural burning caused by lightning and.
Well, I guess the Caribbean is pretty dry, so.
Yeah.
So there is indeed natural fires also in the record. I mean, I think in the situation I showed, the idea comes mostly from digging sites where we found actual traces of deforestation. So that's why it's not an indirect evidence for that, but we touched with our hands, trees being felled and burnt. So, but indeed there are natural fires in the record, totally. So.
Thank you. I really enjoy your talk. Thank you. I think that we all agree that geoarchaeology is very important for us, right? And I was very pleased to see that, I work in the Leron Mediterranean. I find this dark earth everywhere, and I was very pleased to see that also, from geoarchaeology you have different, interpretation of what those dark earth are, because it's pretty apparent in the excavation that sometimes it's a rubbish dump, right? Other times it's not that clear, so there's been much concern about this dark earth. But agreeing with the importance of geoarchaeology, this is more a general question, right? Is something that is worrying me all the time, right? Because we have many different types of analysis that we could use in an excavation. Geoarchaeology being one of those, but pollen analysis, phytolith analysis, ceramic analysis, which is something that I do. But we have also limited budgets in the excavations, and sometimes we have also to conform what the authorities want to do or allow us to do. So I always have this discussion in a more broader sense, like there are so many things that we can do, but what can we do to be able to do all those things, right? Because it's not that easy when you manage like a large scale project to decide, what your priorities will be, or what are the things that you will be able to do with the budget that you might have, right? So that's one more general thing that I want, to discuss with you, if you feel like. And the other thing is like, how can I get a geoarchaeologist to come with me all the time and be on site?
Well, I don't know. I often dream about having an infinite amount of money, So, I think. What can I say? The budget is, of course, a limitation, and more than the budget, I think that the point where specialists and archaeologists, everybody involved in excavation, they can communicate effectively is if they deal with stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is what holds everybody together and forces people to look at the same things, at the same blocks. Otherwise, everything is floating, and this happens often in projects that are not really stratigraphically sound, let's say. To have the geoarchaeologist every time in the field, probably, I think, more training in geoscience to normal archaeologists would already improve the situation, I think, but maybe it varies. In Spain or States is different. In Italy, maybe we have more classical background in archaeology. So, but geoarchaeology is basically archaeology. I mean, if you look at the first archaeologists, Lyell, Boucher de Perthes, all these people were geologists doing archaeology and using stratigraphy. So that's basically, I don't think geoarchaeology is separate from archaeology. It's just, it became separate. It got a different name at some point.
You've demonstrated, I think, quite well. Jim?
Yeah, so I'm a geochemist. So I'm curious, one of the big things that we see in our field now is we've gone from across these different scales. And the big scale we're pushing now is nano.
Yeah.
And, you know, and a lot of that's trying to zoom in and look at sort of grain context and figure out, you know, how materials are moving between different mineral grains to figure out the pathways of formation of those, which brings you back to the bigger picture of environment. I guess I was just wondering, is this something that people are thinking about in your field? Are people trying to push, I don't know, nanosims or some of these other methods for really trying to characterize very, very, very small particles?
Well, there's a lot of, I don't know if they go to the nanoscale, but I mean, there's many techniques now that are being used on the thin section. Okay, so on the glass micro. So basically, it's a bit of a problem sometimes because the basic unit of observation used to be the profile, you know? And then from there you did all your observation. Now we're going toward, in some cases, going towards the basic unit of observation is your thin section, which is already a sample, so it's already part of a whole thing. And then we're going more into the thin section with very, very precise techniques, and it's not always the path on the way back is followed properly. So sometimes you end up with circular questions, and you know, answering your own question basically that was not an archaeological question. Okay, I see that.
Lost in the
weeds
down there. But
Yeah, I think it's a little bit this image here, you know, like people, you know, going too much into the detail. But yeah, we use EDS, X-rays, okay, XRF, micro XRD, all these kind of things on thin section. So.
Yeah, as a final question.
Has it been possible to correlate soil degradation and other profiles in soil with changes in human settlement patterns or migration patterns that would show that the civilizations or the cultures had an awareness of what had happened to their soil and they then moved or changed their practices at all agriculturally because of?
I mean, from what I know, it's mostly basically that cultures tend to use the resources to the max and then move on somehow, you know, and just destroy and live, basically. This is true for also the Neolithic in the Low Countries, basically, where the forest regrowth rate was not fast enough, and at some point they just leave the whole area. Belgium, Holland, I think, more or less.
That's an interesting point. But
Yeah.
one of the additional points is precisely when those sort of more bigger questions, the archaeological, more interpretive element comes into it. So you can do your geological observations, but then actually, if you want to sort of come to those sort of very much broader and large scale questions, it's, you know, turns more into your archaeological interpretive problem, but which is nonetheless all the more.
Yeah,
just as
a
interesting.
fusion between the two areas really there.
But I think with that we're coming to a point where we could move to further discussion over a glass of wine next door. And before we invite you to thank Cristiano once more, I had realized that I forgot one point in my opening, which was to mention that this talk, as well as the a workshop that Cristiano is doing on Friday, are both co-sponsored by IBES, which is very appropriate given the geological context, as you've heard. So, but on that note, let's thank Cristiano.